Hey guys, Corey, Faymus Media. I'm here at Times Square and I have the 5D Mark IV. So, what's different about the Canon 5D Mark IV versus the 5D Mark III? Absolutely everything. Same autofocusing system as the 1DX Mark II, same 3.2-inch, 1.6 million dot screen. It's identical. The only difference between the 1DX Mark II and the 5D Mark IV is the 1DX Mark II gets 60 frames in 4K, whereas the 5D Mark IV only gets 30. And the 120 frames on the 1DX Mark II is now down to 60 frames on the 5D Mark IV, but you'll get the 120 frames on 720p. Now, this is a different sensor. Digic 6 processor, 30.8 megapixel sensor, whereas the 5D Mark III was considerably less at 22 megapixels. This is a much better camera in every way, and I'll get into those details in just a second. We got the ISO range expanded all the way to 102,400. The 5D Mark IV has dual pixel RAW, so when you're shooting photos, if you miss focus, you'll be able to adjust that in post. Lightroom doesn't have it yet, but Canon software does. Pretty soon when Lightroom adds that, you'll be able to use it there as well and be able to adjust the focus in images. If you miss a spot and it's critical, you'll be able to make small, minute adjustments to the focus. So that's a very good feature to have, but it does slow the shooting down from 7 frames. I don't know exactly what you get, but you won't get 7. It'll probably be more like 4 or 5. But the autofocusing system in the 5D Mark IV is brilliant. 7 frames a second on the CF card or on the SD card. It's just an absolute gem. Another thing that's great about this camera is its portrait depth, its bit color depth, and dynamic range. The 5DSR only gets 11.7 stops, whereas this is more like 13.7. Most Nikon and Sony cameras are in the low to mid 14s. Most Canon DSLRs, especially the 5DSR and the 5D Mark III, 12.1 at best or 12.4. So it's a big difference. You know, the 5D Mark III, at best, I was getting 12.4. Most scenarios, 12.1. This is a big step up to be able to get that kind of dynamic range in a Canon camera, which is why I have added it to my arsenal. And I put the D800 on the shelf this whole week. I shot 2 events and 3 weddings on the 5D Mark IV, and that is saying something coming from Nikon shooter. The 5D Mark IV is just spectacular. It has a bunch of different features, one is which they moved the Mark IV up here from the bottom. Now you have a remote terminal here. It's got Wi-Fi and GPS with NFC built in. It's just brilliant. It does not do 4K out via HDMI, only 1080p, just like the 1DX Mark II, but it's got a CF card and an SD card, just like the 5D Mark III and all other Canon cameras, with the exception of the 1DX and 1DX Mark II. So if you're asking how does the camera perform, we're gonna put it to work on the streets. We're gonna do some video and some photos, but I wanna go over one last thing before we do that. It's something that I absolutely love, and I'm so glad they added it, and that's this button right here. If you're wondering what this button is, it will allow you to program it to control the autofocusing system. So I have programmed my back button, which is now programmable on the Canons, to go between servo and single point. This will allow me to change from group function into single point focus, or I can change to use all the autofocusing points to auto detect. I've put the D800 up on the shelf for the past week, and this has been the go-to camera, and it's just been splendid. Canon finally got it right. Now, there are a lot of complaints that I've heard about the 5D Mark IV. It's probably because they've been expecting more. They wanted all the 1DX Mark II features in the 5D Mark IV, and they wanted the 1DX Mark II to have the 1DC features. Well, that's not gonna happen because Canon's got the 1DC Mark II coming out at some point here. So, if you're thinking this is not worth it, it truly is. The 5D Mark IV is definitely a better camera than the 5D Mark III. We're not even in the same atmosphere here. Different planet altogether. 10 more megapixels, or actually 8 more megapixels, better autofocusing in low light. Just overall much more customizable for shooting a wedding, and more dynamic range. That's the key. The sensor performs better. I can't stress that enough. This is the best 5 series camera that Canon has, period. Unless you're a landscape photographer and you're shooting wildlife and you need the 50 megapixels, but even then 30 is more than enough. This is the camera to get from Canon. So let's hit the streets and let's put this camera to work and let's see it in action. We're at Times Square and I absolutely love the 5D Mark IV. Like I said, I'm buying it. So it's gonna go with my 1DX Mark II and gonna use them side by side with my Nikons, but I'm gonna be using this more than the D800 as I absolutely love this camera, which I've said many times. So let's put it to work, let's take a walk around and let's do it. So one thing worth mentioning is the 5D Mark IV's touchscreen is just like the Nikon D5. It's literally half the price of the D5 and it has all the same touchscreen features. In fact, this camera as an all in all is probably the better camera than the D5, which is Nikon's flagship. If you get a battery grip for this camera, it'll do pretty much what the D5 can't do, which is DCI 4K. The 5D Mark IV is a brilliant camera. Fully operational touchscreen. You can even program the lock button to turn the touch feature off, which is great. So you can have it just like the 1DX Mark II. So I've programmed this back button to servo or one shot. Right now I'm in servo. Gonna switch over to single shot. The metering is brilliant in this camera as well. So I got it in servo mode right now. Awesome. So the 5D Mark IV has got the same autofocusing system as the 1DX Mark II, which is brilliant. I did a wedding yesterday and had no out of focus shots, especially in the dance floor. It was focusing really, really good. This is an amazing lens to use. It's a 24-70 USM2. I've also programmed the joystick on the back to control where my autofocusing points are, so I can move it around and track subjects as they're walking. It's always entertaining down here at Times Square. This is a shot where I'm going to use C-Log. I have a custom C-Log profile I'm going to use here to get as much dynamic range as I can. So with this custom C-Log profile I got in the camera, you're probably going to be able to achieve 14 stops or close. What I love about this camera, it's 30 megapixels, it looks great, but I also love the screen. The screen is beautiful, pinch to zoom and swipe. It's a very, very nice screen, and I can just check my focus by pinching to zoom. I wish they had given us an option to not have the AA filter on the camera, but it's just an absolutely stunning camera in every way. Canon have gotten it right. This camera they have definitely done right. So easy to change settings, so easy to switch from continuous to single. Everything's programmable on this camera, everything. Just a fantastic, fantastic camera. Quick to focus, very quick to focus. Me and Ray actually filmed a review video here about a year and a half ago. Actually 2 years ago now. It was the D4S video. Much more packed now than it was then. There's always good stuff going on in Times Square. And what better day to celebrate than with the 5D Mark IV. So I'm just holding the button down to use the servo function and let the camera track. And that guy got a picture there. It's pretty cool. And it's tracking everybody, how they're just moving in front of the camera, moving out of the camera. And you can program the camera to do different types of servo tracking, erratic subjects, and just tracks everything that's moving. Anything that steps in front of your autofocusing points, it tracks it instantly. Just brilliant. It's just so brilliant. That car and that lady in that last picture I just posted here, you capture them, focused on them instantly. Now I'm doing it again. Let's take a few pictures. People randomly coming into frame. Moving the autofocus points around are brilliant. Absolutely amazing how quickly this camera will focus. For the first time in 4 years, I've actually put my D800 on the shelf. I've been using the 5D Mark IV the last 2 weeks and I just can't stop talking about it. It's great. They finally got it right. I know I've said that a couple of times, but
I don't want to do it no more. I know that is good.
now the only thing I wish they had done with this camera is given us the option to buy one without an anti-aliasing filter. I really, really wish they would have done that. Would have made the images even sharper. The 5D Mark IV, I believe, from using it over the last couple of weeks, does have a little bit better color portrait bit depth than the 1DX Mark II, which pretty much is saying the same thing that DxO Mark said. The 30 megapixel sensor really is going to give it slightly better bit depth on the color than the 1DX Mark II. It's aimed more at weddings, landscape photographers. 1DX Mark II is more sports, but I also use it at weddings as well. But this camera is definitely going to give you all the images you could ever desire in landscape or wedding photography. It truly is a between camera of the 5D Mark III and the 5DSR, but better than both, if that makes any sense. It's right in between with megapixel count, but it's better than both. If you don't need 50 megapixels, this is better than both of them for sure in every way. This pretty much makes the 5D Mark III obsolete. 24-70 USM2 on the streets at f2.8 at night in Times Square is perfect with this camera, literally perfect. And the shutter is very quiet. The shutter is definitely quiet. Here we are at 640 ISO. It's absolutely brilliant. We could go higher if we wanted. The 5D Mark IV is very similar in many ways to the 1DX Mark II. It's not quite as good in low light as the 1DX Mark II. This is a very good camera in low light. I'm able to shoot images up to 3200, 6400 ISO, practically no noise, even right here on the streets. It's a really good camera in low light considering it's 30 megapixels. It's not as light sensitive as the D800 or the D810 though. So if you're shooting an image at 1600 ISO, on the D810, you probably need to be shooting at 2000 or 2500 on the 5D Mark IV. It's about 1/3 of a stop to 2/3 of a stop sensitivity difference, but it performs well in low light. I'm actually going to add the D800 low light comparison at the end of this video and the 1DX Mark II. So we're going to see how the 5D Mark IV compares in low light. But I'm 100% positive it's going to be better in low light than the D800. It's definitely much better technology. It's 4 years newer technology. So this is really, really the all-around package. 30 megapixels, and it's better in low light than most cameras are at 20. I wouldn't doubt this is better in low light than the 7D Mark II or the 5D Mark III, and you're getting all that extra information too. I just love I've been able to program the back button to single shot or servo, and this new added button to the 5D Mark IV to switch the type of group or single point for that type of autofocus, just like the Nikon. I'm so glad that this is now an added feature to the 5D Mark IV. It's the one complaint I've always had about Canon cameras and why I stay with Nikon, plus dynamic range, and they've addressed both of those in the 5D Mark IV. Gotten so comfortable shooting on it that I almost don't want to give it back. That's why I had to buy my own. Let's try one-handed servo focusing on the camera when we're not even looking to the viewfinder. Tracking beautifully. Well, the images don't lie. I wasn't looking to the viewfinder, and as you can see, they're tack sharp. So one of the items I have set up in the viewfinder with the customizable button is the autofocusing area select, and you can set up different ways to track. And if you want to use a wide area of autofocusing points, you can do that by selecting these last two by checking them on or off. And that's what I'm using right now, which is great. Anywhere in your entire range, it's going to focus on that. So out of all the autofocusing points in the camera, it's using all of them to track, very similar to 3D on the Nikon cameras do. And that's what I love about this camera, and the fact that it's much more responsive than any other Canon camera, besides the 1DX Mark II, of course.
For the last time, everybody clap your hands. Clap. Clap.
So let's go ahead and switch over to some video. Let's do some 4K, 24p. They've given us grid, and they've also given us our histogram. Just by hitting the information button at the top. Cycling the info button will give you everything you need to know about the back. You hit the Q button for quick, and you can change your picture style. It's got touch to focus. It'll track subjects. Actually, you can see it on the screen. It's tracking. If I move the camera, it tracks whatever subject I touch. Just beautiful. Just amazing camera. I've had a lot of people complain about the motion JPEG on the 1DX Mark II video. It's much better than H.264, much better. If you guys really want to shoot H.264, shoot 1080p. I don't recommend shooting H.264 in 4K. It's just, the codec's great as a final output format for delivery. If you're shooting in motion JPEG, it's better. You can finalize your output to H.264. It's really hard to color grade H.264, which is why the MXF file wrapper is what most Canons shoot on for their professional cinema line. The Sonys have the XAVCS codec, which is for their S-Log 2 and 3 on the Sony A7S and A7S Mark II, and they'll come in an MP4 wrap format. But H.264 QuickTime movie or MP4 is really not ideal. It's good for space savings, but you're gonna be shooting and filling up a lot more cards, and that's why people are getting upset. But motion JPEG is every frame that's recorded is keyframe, and better dynamic range, better for grading. So yes, it does take up more card space, larger files, but it's sharper too. It's much better format. You could arguably say that it's outdated, but it's still better than H.264. That's a fact, guys. Canon have really pulled through on these cameras, 5D Mark IV and 1DX Mark II. This video is just spectacular. Next to the 1DX Mark II, it's the best DSLR for video, period. It's better than any Nikon. 5D Mark IV is better than any Nikon for shooting video. It's just wonderful. A 64 gigabyte SD card or CF card will give you a decent amount of room. I've been shooting photos and video on it for a little over an hour now, and I still have 13 minutes of 4K motion JPEG 24p. So you might get like 15 to 20 minutes of 4K for a 64 gig card. 128 will give you 40 minutes. 256 should give you about an hour and a half, hour and 45. That's more than enough. You get yourself a bunch of cards and you're shooting all day. It's a great format to edit in. If you haven't edited motion JPEG before, it's much better, like I said, than H.264, especially with a flat profile. You're getting more room to grade. When you grade footage, you want to grade in flat so you get a cinema look. You want to be able to push things in post a little bit. And while it's not raw, it's a big jump from H.264. Now, a lot of people are complaining. So many people are complaining that they don't like the 1.6 crop in the 5D Mark IV or the 1DX Mark II, but it's because we've been spoiled for years with full frame sensors, utilizing the full frame sensor for 1080p like the 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, and D800, and many more, T5i, T6i. This is not good because you have a sensor like, for example, in the 5D Mark IV, 6720 by 4480, that's 6K, almost 7K images. So you have a 6.7K sensor and you want to output 4K video. It's not going to happen. So what the camera's doing is it's processing out that image, removing information, and downsizing. There's only two ways to do this: line skipping and pixel binning, which gives you soft images. You don't want that. You want to utilize a true native size to 4K, which is why most film sensors are Super 35. With the 1.6 crop, you are actually getting a very close to native size for 4K, which is why the images are so sharp. You're not going to get that utilizing full frame. I know we've been spoiled over the years with that feature. You're gonna have to get wider angle lenses because 1.6 crop is actually what I desire and most professionals desire. They want the Super 35 size so they can get a good true 4K image. It's worth much more than the H.264. Imagine you have H.264 compression on a DSLR 1080p video on a full frame sensor. line skipping, macro blocking, pixel binning. What good is the video if it's destroyed? This is 1.64 crop, motion JPEG, utilizing less compression, the accurate size of the sensor, sharper images, and better color grading. It's fantastic. Canon have delivered. There's no need to complain about that. Now that we understand. So Canons have always been pretty good for video. This is marvelous for video, and it's actually equally as good for photography. As an overall package, the only camera, DSLR-wise, that this would be equal to or maybe possibly less than is the 1DX Mark II. This is absolutely picture perfect. A couple of things that could have given us, like people wanted full frame 4K, don't really want that. Pixel binning, line skipping, we've been over that. But as far as a tilting screen would be cool, and 60 frames in 4K would also be cool. It would also be even cooler if they gave us C-Log. But let's not look at the negativities and look at the positivities and what they did give us in this camera. And what they did give us was the answer to a lot of our complaints. Dynamic range, 4K internal. It was just a few years ago when the 5D Mark III came out, approximately 4 years, when everyone was like, oh, I want 4K internally. Finally, Sony released the A7S, it wasn't 4K. Everyone was complaining there was no 4K internal. The A7S Mark II got it. Then all the Canon guys were like, we want internal 4K. Not only did they give us 4K, but they gave it to us in motion JPEG, which is better. They gave it to us with a crop, which makes it sharper. It's great in low light, and it's 30 megapixels. They really over-delivered, but our expectations, at least some of our expectations, got a little bit, messed up in the process. We expected a little too much, enough to warrant me to buy another camera. That was crazy.
Now it's time for the low light test. And keep in mind, this is a 30 megapixel camera, and it performs beautifully in low light. In fact, anything below 6400 ISO is going to show practically zero noise. This room was very dimly lit, if any light at all, and you can see that 1600 ISO and 3200 ISO, there's no noise, 100% usable image. Moving along to 6400 ISO, yet again, still practically no noise at all. There's traces of it in the shadows. At 12,800, there's more noise in the shadows, but this image is 100% usable, and there's no noise correction on this at all. 25,600 is about the edge of usability. 51,200, you might be able to get away with it in certain circumstances, but this is pretty high for a 30 megapixel camera, and 102,400 is not really usable unless you're absolutely desperate. Let's go ahead and compare it to the D800E, and you're going to see how much technology has evolved over the years. You're not going to see a whole lot of difference below 3200 ISO, but once you start getting north of that, that's where the difference is really truly going to show. 1600 ISO, they're about neck and neck. And we're going to go ahead and move along to 3200 ISO, and you're going to see both cameras perform very well, but the 5D Mark IV is producing better images. At 6400 ISO, it's looking even better, as the D800E is starting to show more noise. At 12,800, it becomes pretty apparent which camera is better in low light, and at 25,600, the D800E taps out, and the 5D Mark IV is still looking very usable. And the 5D Mark IV can continue on to 51,200 and even 102,400. So you can see how much technology's evolved over the last 4 years. So now I have a fun test I want to share with you guys to show you why the two newest Canon cameras have left Nikon behind. And the Nikon D5 is double the cost of the 5D Mark IV, which is what makes this test astounding. What I've done is I've taken 5 different images on each camera, underexposing each image by one-stop increments. The first image is -1 EV all the way to the last image, which is underexposed by -5, which is 5 stops loss. In case you miss a shot and you need to add it back in post, we're going to add those stops back in Lightroom to see which camera has more flexibility, because let's face it, sometimes mistakes happen and you'll miss a shot, or you'll be underexposed and it's the only photo you have. So let's see how they perform. At -1 EV, we add it back in post. Both cameras at ISO 200 are about neck and neck. We're gonna go ahead and do the same thing for 2 stops underexposed. Gonna add those 2 stops back in Lightroom. Yet again, they're still about neck and neck. So now let's go ahead and do the same thing for -3 EV. We're 3 stops underexposed and we're adding 3 back in post, and the Nikon D5 is starting to show some sort of color banding noise. By -4 EV, adding 4 stops back in Lightroom, you can clearly see the D5 is trailing behind, and by the time we add 5 stops back in post, it's falling apart completely, yet the 5D Mark IV has shown no signs of noise at all. Just brilliant. Moving along to ISO 400, we're going to start the same way. -1 stop, adding a stop in post, they're about neck and neck. We move along to -2 EV, add 2 stops back in post, and they're still pretty much the same. They're very well equally matched up until about -3. Once we add 3 stops back in post, the D5 starts to fall apart. And now we're going to go ahead and move along to 4 stops underexposed, adding 4 stops in post at ISO 400 clearly shows the Nikon falling apart yet again. This is a $6,500 camera. And at -5 EV, the Nikon D5 is just falling apart. 5D Mark IV looks awesome. Moving along, going to punch it to 800 ISO, start at -1 EV, and add that 1 stop back in post. Both cameras look absolutely great. And then moving along to -2 EV, add 2 stops back in post. They're still about the same. They're equally matched at this point. By the time we get to -3 stops, adding those 3 stops back in post, the Nikon D5 is starting to show more noise in the shadows yet again. By the time we get to adding 4 stops, the Nikon D5 is almost unusable at this point, and the 5D Mark IV looks amazing. Adding 5 stops at 800 ISO is just horrendous on the Nikon D5. As you can see, the 5D Mark IV completely outperforms the Nikon D5. Now let's go ahead and see how the 5D Mark IV performs against its big brother, the 1DX Mark II. And surprisingly, as you're going to see through the ISO range, the 5D Mark IV keeps up very well. In fact, there is very little difference at all until you get to around 51,200 ISO. And that's not because the 1DX Mark II isn't performing well, it's because the 5D Mark IV just performs so beautifully that you would never expect a camera at this price to be so good in low light. It's unexplainable, but the 5D Mark IV truly is great in low light. As you can see, 25,600 ISO, they're about neck and neck, which is really shocking. Moving along to 51,200 ISO, and you can see yet again, they're still pretty much neck and neck. Better color rendition on the 1DX Mark II though. 102,400, you can see they're still yet again about neck and neck. Slightly better colors in the 1DX Mark II, and of course, the 1DX Mark II can do 204,800 and 409,600, although not really usable, so pretty surprising there. Now let's go ahead and test out the low light in internal 4K, motion JPEG, and the 5D Mark IV and compare it to its older brother, the 1DX Mark II. At ISO 800 and ISO 1600, they're about neck and neck. Very hard to tell a difference between the two cameras. Although the 5D Mark IV seems to be sharper, I don't think I missed focus on the 1DX Mark II, so I do believe for some reason the 5D Mark IV may be sharper. 3200 ISO and 6400 ISO, very little difference between the two cameras. Yet again, they perform about neck and neck. 12,800 ISO, you can see both cameras side by side, they're about the same. It's pretty surprising to see how well the 5D Mark IV does in low light. The Canon 5D Mark IV is not just another number in the 5D series lineup, but an evolution from its predecessors completely. The fact that it's now 30 megapixels and performs better than almost any DSLR on the market today in low light, a beautiful touchscreen, now customizable buttons for servo and single focus, built-in Wi-Fi where you can control the camera in video or photo completely with the Canon app for your iPhone or Android device makes this camera just absolutely a must-have. It also does 7 frames a second, does true DCI internal 4K up to 30 frames a second, 60p in all-eye 1080p, and it's motion JPEG, which is phenomenal for color grading and color correcting. This truly is the DSLR that myself and many professionals have been waiting for many years. I just never thought I'd see it from Canon. But with all the features of this camera at its price point and how it compares to the 1DX Mark II, this camera for its price is the best DSLR on the market today.
The 5D Mark IV is now found its place in my camera bag. It is a wonderful camera that I just want to cuddle with all night long. It's fantastic. Canon has given us everything we needed and everything we wanted. It's just over the last year while waiting for it, we got a little greedy with features. We can't expect 60p and 4K out of a 5D. I mean, we have the technology for it, but it would make no sense. I'm not really defending them. I'm just saying that this camera is great, and Canon have jumped so far ahead now. Much better dynamic range, 7 frames a second, expandable ISO to 102,000, internal 4K up to 30 frames, 60 frames a second in full HD, all-eye 1080p. You can't go wrong. The 61 autofocusing points are spectacular. We're now getting close to 14 stops of dynamic range and over 14 stops with the C-Log custom profile that I have. Technicolor CineStyle will get you over 14 as well. This camera is brilliant. It tracks beautifully, and they've added a feature that I absolutely love. The ability to set this back button to servo or one focus and set the different autofocusing points in the back, like the single, the group, just like Nikon. Very similar to 3D tracking, and 30.8 megapixels is absolutely fantastic with a full-fledged touchscreen. Basically, in short, other than crazy high ISO, this is a better camera than the Nikon D5. But the truth is, it's got internal DCI 4K, and it's 30.8 megapixels, so it's 10 megapixels more. The video features are equal to or better because of DCI, and it's got more megapixel count. It's not a wildlife camera or sport, so it won't shoot as fast, but coming from a landscape, wedding, or portrait or studio photographer, the 5D Mark IV is the best DSLR currently right now. It is fantastic. It's ahead of the 5DSR because there's something worth more than megapixels, and that's dynamic range and portrait color bit depth. And this is the camera for portraiture work. The 5D Mark IV, truly, next to the 1DX Mark II, is not only the best DSLR in Canon's lineup, but currently the best DSLR on the market today. It really is great. So hopefully you guys found this review helpful of the amazing Canon 5D Mark IV. It's spectacular. Don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to purchase any of the gear I review, like the 5D Mark IV 24-70 USM2. Please use the information box below on YouTube and use those links to purchase any gear. Keeps reviews coming, keeps me and Ray out here in the streets till 11 o'clock at night, like tonight, almost midnight, doing this nighttime review with the Canon 5D Mark IV. The forum boards are up. Slow right now, but let's get some users over. Let's start getting the traffic going. It's happyshootingphoto.com. Happyshootingphoto.com is the website. The forum boards are up. You can sign up. Let's start getting some traffic going there. Sign up for our newsletter at faymusmedia.com/blog, but also on our Facebook page, facebook.com/groups/happyshootingphoto. Sign up for the newsletter. It'll be on the right-hand side of the screen on our webpage, or on the left-hand side of the screen on Facebook, and you get all the latest gear and deals from B&H, Adorama, and Amazon. I'm Corey with Faymus Media, and happy shooting.